"Sir, you're going to need to step off the aircraft." The words did not come from anger. They came from procedure. Calm, polite, final. 2 airport security officers stood in the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin, their dark uniforms blocking the soft amber light spilling down from the overhead panels. One of them rested a hand lightly on the back of an empty seat. The other watched the man in seat 2A with the quiet patience of someone who had done this before. Around them, the cabin had fallen into a strange, brittle silence. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to lips. A businessman froze with a fork suspended above a porcelain plate. Somewhere near the galley, a champagne bottle gave a soft pop that sounded far too loud in the stillness. Every eye in the cabin had turned toward the same man, Ethan Walker, 45 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, skin the color of dark walnut polished by years of quiet confidence. His charcoal suit fit him like it had been measured down to the last thread. His shoes shone softly beneath the warm lighting of Aurora Air's most exclusive cabin. And yet here he was, being removed. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. He simply sat there in seat 2A, his hands resting calmly on the armrests, his gaze drifting slowly across the faces watching him. Some looked curious, some looked uncomfortable. A few looked satisfied, and one woman, standing a few feet away in a crisp Navy flight attendant and uniform, looked victorious. Her name was Melissa Grant, 38 years old, senior cabin crew, 20,000 flight hours logged across the Atlantic and Pacific skies. Her blonde hair was pulled into a flawless bun, and her lipstick hadn't smudged even slightly despite the tension crackling through the cabin. Her eyes were fixed on Ethan with the tight, controlled smile of someone who believed she had just solved a problem. "You heard the officers," she said, her voice smooth but edged with ice. "We can't depart until this situation is resolved." The word situation hung in the air like smoke. Ethan slowly turned his head toward her. His expression did not change, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "Situation," he repeated quietly. The officer nearest the aisle cleared his throat. "Sir," he said gently, almost apologetically, "if you'd just come with us, we can sort this out back in the terminal." Ethan's gaze shifted to the officer, then back to Melissa. He inhaled once, slow and measured, as if weighing the cost of every possible choice. Then he stood. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The fabric of his suit pulled smoothly across his shoulders as he rose to his full height, towering slightly over the security officers. The overhead lights caught the edge of his watch, a simple steel timepiece that looked understated until someone noticed the subtle engraving of a Swiss manufacturer known only to collectors. Behind him, a young man in seat 2B leaned forward slightly. Kyle Patterson, 32. Tech startup heir. The kind of passenger who had already finished his second glass of pre-departure champagne and assumed the world arranged itself around his comfort. He let out a soft chuckle under his breath. "Unbelievable," Kyle murmured to no one in particular. "They're letting anyone wander into first class these days." Melissa heard it. She did not correct him. She only kept watching Ethan. Ethan reached up calmly and pulled a slim leather briefcase from the overhead compartment. The case was dark brown, the leather worn smooth in a way that suggested years of use rather than fashion. He held it lightly at his side. No shaking hands, no raised voice. Just stillness. As he stepped into the aisle, the cabin seemed to shrink around him. Rows of expensive seats, polished metal, soft carpeting, a floating palace above the clouds, and in that palace the judgment had already been passed. The older man in seat 3C slowly folded his newspaper, his pale eyebrows knitting together in quiet discomfort. A woman across the aisle lowered her phone just enough that the small red recording light was no longer visible. Everyone sensed it. Something was wrong here. But no one spoke. Because first class had rules, and one of those rules was simple. Do not disrupt the order. Ethan paused beside Melissa. Up close, the height difference between them forced her to tilt her chin slightly upward. For a fraction of a second, the confident smile on her face flickered. There was something about the way he looked at her. Not anger, not embarrassment. Judgment. "Is there anything else you'd like to add to the report?" Ethan asked quietly. Melissa blinked. Her smile tightened again. "Yes," she said, folding her arms lightly across her chest. "I'd note that you were argumentative with crew instructions and refused multiple safety requests." The officer beside them shifted his weight slightly. Ethan tilted his head. "Safety requests," he repeated. Melissa didn't hesitate. "Your briefcase placement. You challenged crew authority. You continued using your phone during taxi preparation." Her voice carried just enough volume that the surrounding passengers could hear. And they did. Kyle Patterson smirked openly now, swirling the last sip of champagne in his glass. "Told you," he muttered. Guy thought the rules didn't apply to him. Still, Ethan did not react. Not to Kyle, not to Melissa. He only looked toward the cabin windows where the runway lights of JFK stretched into the distance like glowing threads across the darkening evening. Then he spoke. "You know," he said calmly, "I've flown more miles in the past 10 years than most pilots." Melissa's smile hardened. "That may be," she replied coolly, "but on this aircraft, my crew's instructions are the ones that matter." For the first time, something close to a smile touched Ethan's mouth. Not amusement. Recognition. Like a chess player realizing the opponent had just made a catastrophic move. The security officer gestured gently toward the front of the cabin. "Sir, if you'd come this way." Ethan nodded once. He stepped forward. The aisle seemed longer now, narrower. As he walked toward the aircraft door, the quiet hum of the engines waiting to power up vibrated faintly through the floor beneath his shoes. Behind him, the whispers began. Low, curious, nervous. Did he threaten someone? I think he refused instructions. They can't risk a disruptive passenger. Melissa remained near the front galley, watching him approach. And for the first time since this started, she felt a strange ripple of unease move through her chest. Not because of what he had done, but because of how calm he still looked. Ethan reached the open door of the aircraft. The cool air from the jet bridge drifted into the warm cabin. He stopped, turned slightly, and looked back down the aisle. The passengers. Melissa, the captain standing near the cockpit door. His voice, when it came, was low enough that people had to lean forward to hear it. "You just made the most expensive mistake your airline will ever make." Then he stepped out of the aircraft, and none of them, Not the captain, not Melissa Grant, not the laughing tech heir in seat 2B, had the slightest idea that the man they had just removed from seat 2A was the one person in the world who could buy the entire airline. The cabin door closed with a heavy, hollow click behind him. The sound echoed through the narrow jet bridge like the final note of a verdict. Ethan Walker walked slowly beneath the cold fluorescent lights. His footsteps were steady, even. The soft leather of his shoes whispered against the metal floor with every step. Behind him, the muffled roar of the aircraft engines began to rise as the plane prepared for pushback. Neither security officer rushed him. One of them, Officer Ramirez, walked slightly ahead with a hand resting casually on his radio. The other, Officer Dalton, stayed half a step behind Ethan, watching him with quiet curiosity. Dalton had escorted hundreds of passengers off flights during his 12 years working airport security. Most were loud. Some were angry. A few were drunk. None of them had been this calm. "Sir," Dalton said gently, "we'll just need a quick statement for the airline incident report. Shouldn't take long." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He paused at the end of the jet bridge where the glass wall overlooked the runway. Outside, the evening sky over JFK had turned a deep cobalt blue. Taxiway lights blinked in long rows across the tarmac like silent Morse code. Beyond the glass, the Aurora air. Moi. A 350 was slowly pushing away from the gate. Ethan watched it, watched the wingtip lights blink once, twice, then disappear as the aircraft turned toward the runway. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Calm, controlled. Dalton cleared his throat. "Sir." Ethan turned. His voice was low and steady. "That report won't be necessary." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Airline procedure says, I'm aware of airline procedure." The words were quiet, but carried weight. Ramirez studied him more carefully now. Something about the man's tone felt different. Not arrogant, not defensive, authoritative. Still, he nodded politely. "Look, Mr. Walker, right? We're just doing our job." Ethan gave a small nod. "And you did it well." That seemed to catch them off guard. Ramirez shifted his stance slightly. "Most passengers don't say that. I'm not most passengers." The statement hung in the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Across the terminal corridor, travelers rushed past, dragging roller bags behind them. Loudspeaker announcements echoed through the ceiling speakers. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Life in the airport moved on. But inside Ethan's mind, something else was happening. Something colder. More precise. Dalton finally spoke again. "You have someone meeting you here tonight?" Ethan slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. "Yes." He tapped once. The screen lit up. One name sat at the top of his contact list. Rachel Morgan. Ethan pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then a woman's voice answered immediately. "Rachel Morgan. Rachel." The moment she heard his voice, something in her tone sharpened. "Ethan? I thought you were boarding." "I was." Silence. Rachel Morgan had worked beside Ethan Walker for almost 15 years. She knew the subtle shifts in his voice, the way a seasoned pilot feels changes in air pressure. Something had happened. "What went wrong?" she asked quietly. Ethan glanced once more through the glass toward the runway. The Aurora Air aircraft had begun its slow taxi toward the departure line. They removed me from the plane. Another silence. Longer this time. In Rachel's Manhattan office, 40 floors above Park Avenue, the city lights reflected across the dark windows behind her desk. She slowly set down the financial report she'd been reviewing. "Removed?" she repeated. "Yes." "For what reason?" Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "According to them," he said calmly, "I was a safety concern." Rachel let out a slow breath. "Tell me exactly what happened." Ethan leaned lightly against the glass wall of the terminal, and he told her. Not with anger, not with exaggeration, just facts. Melissa Grant, the questioning look, the boarding pass inspection, the briefcase argument, the phone accusation, the captain, the security escort. When he finished, Rachel didn't speak for several seconds. Then she said one word. "Interesting." Ethan's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You find this amusing?" "No." Her voice had turned cold. "I find it expensive." Ethan almost smiled. Around them, the airport continued its endless motion. Passengers hurried to gates. Suitcases rolled. Coffee machines hissed behind cafe counters. None of them realized that somewhere between Gate 32 and the departure runway, the future of an airline had just changed direction. Rachel spoke again. "Which airline?" "Aurora Air." Her fingers were already moving across her keyboard, keys clicking rapidly. Within seconds, multiple financial windows filled her monitors. Aurora Air. Subsidiary. Parent structure. Ownership charts. "Interesting," she repeated. Ethan waited. "What did you find?" Rachel leaned back slightly in her chair. Aurora Air is owned by Atlas Meridian Group. Ethan knew the name. Every major investor on Wall Street knew the name. Atlas Meridian Group, a British financial conglomerate with holdings in aviation, shipping, luxury hotels, and infrastructure across 3 continents. "Chairman?" Ethan asked. Rachel glanced at the screen. "Charles Whitmore, 67. Old money. 3rd-generation corporate aristocracy." Ethan's gaze returned to the runway. The Aurora Air aircraft had reached the takeoff line. Its engines roared to full power. "What's their market valuation?" he asked. "Approximately £25 billion. Ethan nodded slowly. The plane surged forward down the runway. For a few seconds it raced through the darkness, then lifted into the sky. Rachel spoke again. "You want to sue them?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Rachel already knew the answer before he said it. But she asked anyway. "What do you want to do?" Ethan watched the aircraft disappear into the clouds. Then he spoke quietly. "I want to own them." In her office, Rachel Morgan leaned forward slowly. The faintest smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I thought you might say that." Ethan pushed away from the glass. "When can we move?" Rachel's fingers were already moving again. "We start tonight." Ethan glanced toward the departure board glowing across the terminal wall. Flights leaving for London, Paris, Zurich. Markets that never really slept. Good. Rachel paused. Ethan? Yes. Her voice softened slightly. Are you doing this for revenge? Ethan looked back once more toward the empty runway where the aircraft had taken off minutes earlier. No. His tone was calm, controlled. Revenge is emotional. He began walking toward the terminal exit. I'm doing it because someone at Aurora Air forgot a very basic rule of business. Rachel waited. Ethan stepped through the sliding glass doors into the cool New York night. Then he finished the sentence. You never humiliate the person who can buy your company. Rain had started falling by the time Ethan Walker stepped out of the terminal at JFK. Not a storm, just a thin, steady drizzle that blurred the runway lights and turned the pavement black and reflective like polished stone. Taxi engines hummed along the curb. Drivers shouted names. Luggage wheels rattled across concrete. Ethan stood still for a moment beneath the awning. He watched the rain. Inside the terminal behind him, the departure board clicked and shifted. More flights leaving. More passengers climbing into aircraft cabins, where strangers judged each other in quiet, invisible ways. A black sedan rolled up to the curb. The driver stepped out immediately. Mid-50s, grey suit, calm posture. Mr. Walker. Ethan nodded. The driver opened the rear door. Car's ready, sir. Ethan slid into the back seat. The leather was warm. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and new upholstery. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud that sealed the chaos of the airport outside. The car pulled away from the curb. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Outside the window, Queens drifted past in wet reflections of traffic lights and neon storefronts. The skyline of Manhattan glowed faintly in the distance like a promise carved into the horizon. Ethan's phone buzzed once in his hand. Rachel Morgan again, he answered. I've been digging, she said without greeting. Her voice carried the clipped rhythm of someone who had already been working for the past hour, without pause. Ethan leaned back slightly. What did you find? Atlas Meridian Group is exactly what you'd expect. Old European money. Aviation Division alone controls 6 regional carriers, including Aurora Air. And Whitmore. Charles Whitmore inherited the chairmanship 12 years ago. Family money built the empire after the war. Shipping, hotels, airlines. The financial press treats him like royalty. Ethan stared through the rain-speckled window. Royalty, he repeated quietly. Rachel continued. But there's something interesting. Ethan waited. The company looks strong from the outside. Revenues stable. But underneath it's messy. How messy? Debt from an acquisition 2 years ago. Several underperforming divisions. And something else? Papers shuffled faintly on her end of the call. What? The Internal Pension Fund. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Rachel lowered her voice, as if the walls around her might be listening. They've been using Atlas Meridian stock as collateral to prop up the fund's shortfall. How large? Hard to tell exactly, but conservative estimate. Several £100 million. Ethan said nothing for a moment. The sedan merged onto the expressway. Rain streaked sideways across the windows now, as the car picked up speed. Rachel spoke again. If their share price drops even 10%, the pension fund could become insolvent. A faint smile touched Ethan's mouth. Interesting. That's what I thought. Another pause stretched across the line. Rachel asked quietly, "Do you want me to begin assembling the acquisition team?" Ethan looked out across the dark skyline forming ahead. No. No, not yet. Rachel frowned somewhere in Manhattan. Ethan, if we're going to do this quietly, time matters. I know. Then what are you waiting for? The car passed beneath a highway overpass. The shadow swallowed the interior for a second before the city lights returned. Ethan spoke calmly. Right now, Atlas Meridian believes tonight was just an unpleasant airline complaint. Yes, I'd prefer it stayed that way. Rachel understood immediately. You want them blind? Exactly. The sedan exited the highway and began weaving through Manhattan streets. Wet pavement reflected the gold glow of street lamps and skyscraper windows. Rachel's keyboard began clicking again. If we move through direct purchases, regulators will notice within days. We won't move directly. Rachel stopped typing. You're thinking shell structures? Yes. How many? As many as it takes. Rachel let out a soft breath. You're planning a ghost acquisition. Ethan didn't answer, but she didn't need him to. After 15 years working beside him, Rachel Morgan understood how Ethan Walker thought. He never attacked the front door of a fortress. He dissolved the foundations underneath it. I'll need legal, she said. Daniel Brooks. I was already dialing him. Good. The car slowed at a red light on Park Avenue. Outside, pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas, unaware that the conversation unfolding inside the quiet black sedan could reshape a multinational corporation. Rachel continued. I'll start building a network of acquisition vehicles tonight. Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. Keep each stake below 5%. Of course. That keeps us below disclosure thresholds. Rachel smiled slightly. You taught me that rule. Ethan glanced at the skyline towering above the street. I taught you a lot of things. Rachel laughed softly. That you did. The traffic light turned green. The sedan rolled forward again. Rachel spoke more seriously now. Ethan, there's something else. What? I looked into Aurora Air specifically. And? The CEO, name? Philip Harrington, 58, career airline executive, known for aggressive cost-cutting and, let's say, questionable customer service culture. Ethan's expression did not change. Rachel continued. There's a complaint department report from 6 months ago that flagged declining satisfaction ratings. Apparently, their first-class service reputation has been slipping. Ethan looked back toward the rain-swept window. Interesting. Rachel hesitated. Ethan. Yes. You realize what happens if we pull this off. Tell me. You won't just own Aurora Air. I know. You'll control Atlas Meridian Group. The car turned into a quiet driveway beside a tall limestone building. The Carlyle Hotel, one of Manhattan's oldest and most discreet addresses. Ethan's driver pulled to a smooth stop beneath the canopy. Rachel's voice came through the phone one more time. This isn't a lawsuit anymore. No. This is a corporate war. Ethan opened the car door. Cool rain air drifted into the cabin. "Yes," he said calmly. He stepped out onto the sidewalk. Across the street, the lights of Central Park shimmered through the rain. The doorman rushed forward with an umbrella. Rachel spoke again, almost amused now. All because a flight attendant didn't like the man in seat 2A. Ethan paused beneath the umbrella. The memory of Melissa Grant's tight smile flickered briefly through his mind. Not anger, not hatred, just calculation. Then he answered quietly, "No." The hotel doors opened. Warm golden light spilled out onto the wet pavement. "This isn't because of seat 2A. Rachel waited. Ethan walked inside. His voice carried one final note of cold certainty. "It's because they forgot something every business eventually learns." "What's that?" Ethan stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut. "You should always know who your customer really is." The elevator doors opened onto the 32nd floor of the Carlyle with a soft, almost ceremonial chime. Ethan Walker stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with thick carpet and muted lighting. The city's noise was gone up here. No horns, no shouting drivers, just the low hum of climate control and the distant rhythm of rain against tall windows. A suite door at the end of the hall stood slightly open. Rachel Morgan was already inside. She stood beside a wide walnut conference table, sleeves rolled up, dark hair pulled into a loose knot. Several laptops were open in front of her, their screens glowing with financial charts and corporate ownership diagrams that crawled across the displays like living maps. Daniel Brooks sat beside her. 50 years old, steel-grey hair, glasses resting low on his nose. A legal pad filled with tight handwriting in front of him. Daniel had spent 2 decades navigating the legal architecture of international finance. There were few people alive who understood the hidden corridors of corporate ownership better than he did. He looked up when Ethan entered. "Well," Daniel said calmly, "this escalated quickly." Ethan removed his jacket and draped it across the back of a chair. "Did Rachel brief you?" "She gave me the short version." Daniel tapped the legal pad lightly with his pen. "Airline crew humiliates billionaire investor. Billionaire investor decides to buy the airline." Rachel glanced up. "Not the airline?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. I understand. The parent company." He leaned back slightly. "Atlas Meridian Group." Ethan walked to the tall windows overlooking Central Park. Rain streaked across the glass, distorting the city lights below into blurred rivers of gold and red. "What do we know?" Ethan asked. Rachel turned her laptop slightly so both men could see. The screen displayed a complex web of corporate structures. "This," she said, tapping the center of the diagram, "is Atlas Meridian. From that central node, dozens of smaller branches spread outward. Aviation division includes Aurora Air and 3 other carriers across Europe. Shipping subsidiary operates freight routes across the Mediterranean. Hotel chain with luxury properties in London, Rome, and Zurich." Daniel adjusted his glasses. "And their ownership?" Rachel zoomed in. 52% of shares are spread across British institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers. No single entity holds more than 6%. Ethan nodded slowly. "Fragmented ownership." "Exactly." Daniel tapped his pen again. That means vulnerable governance. Rachel clicked another window open. A financial report appeared. Debt from the Carrington Hotel acquisition 2 years ago is still weighing on them. £6 billion. Daniel raised his eyebrows. 6 billion. Rachel nodded. Operating margins have also slipped 14% over the last 18 months. Ethan turned from the window. So the empire is showing cracks. Daniel smiled faintly. Every empire does eventually. Rachel leaned forward. But the real weakness is here. She pulled up another document. Atlas Meridian Employee Pension Fund. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Projected returns, collateral structures, asset allocations. Rachel pointed to a highlighted column. They've been using Atlas Meridian stock to backfill the pension deficit. Daniel's pen stopped moving. How large is the deficit? Rachel exhaled. Officially? £30 million. Daniel snorted softly. And unofficially? Rachel scrolled further down. Closer to 300 million. Silence filled the room. Ethan studied the numbers. 300 million backed by their own stock. Rachel nodded. If the share price drops even 10%, the entire fund becomes illiquid overnight. Daniel leaned forward now, his interest fully captured. That's catastrophic. Rachel looked at Ethan. Which means the company is balanced on a glass throne. Ethan folded his arms. All it takes is one stone. Daniel spoke quietly. You're thinking about triggering a market reaction. Not triggering, Ethan said calmly. Revealing. Rachel understood instantly. You want the press to discover the pension exposure. Ethan nodded once. Daniel leaned back again, studying him carefully. You realize that once that information leaks, Atlas Meridian stock could collapse. That's the idea. Rachel's fingers moved rapidly across her keyboard. We'd need to accumulate shares before the news breaks. Exactly. Daniel frowned slightly. Even through shell companies, acquiring that much stock without raising suspicion will take months. Ethan turned back to the window. Lightning flickered somewhere over the Hudson River. We have months. Rachel glanced up. You're certain? Ethan watched the storm moving across the skyline. Charles Whitmore doesn't even know I exist. Daniel smiled faintly. That's usually the moment when powerful men are most vulnerable. Rachel opened another window. Here's the chairman. A photograph filled the screen. Charles Whitmore, 67 years old, silver hair, thick gold signet ring, standing beside a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new hotel property in London. His smile was confident, comfortable, the expression of a man who had never truly feared losing power. Daniel studied the image. Old British aristocracy. Rachel nodded. Third-generation wealth. Ethan spoke quietly. And men like him always believe their world is permanent. Daniel closed the legal pad. So let's talk mechanics, Rachel straightened. I've already begun registering acquisition entities. Daniel looked impressed. How many? Rachel glanced at her notes. 23 so far. Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. Daniel chuckled softly. Efficient. Ethan walked back to the table. How quickly can they begin buying? Rachel didn't hesitate. Tomorrow morning when the London market opens. Daniel raised a finger. But each purchase must remain below 5% to avoid disclosure requirements. Rachel nodded. That's the plan. Ethan studied the glowing financial charts on the table. Numbers moving, shares trading, fortunes shifting invisibly through global markets. This won't look like an attack, Rachel said. It'll look like normal investor activity. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Until the day you reveal yourself. Ethan's expression remained calm. When that day comes, he said quietly, Atlas Meridian will already belong to us. Rachel smiled slowly. Daniel shook his head with quiet admiration. All this, he murmured, because a flight attendant decided someone didn't belong in first class. Ethan looked at him. No. Daniel waited. Ethan's voice dropped, steady and cold. All this because an entire system still believes power has a certain face. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain hammered against the glass windows like applause from an unseen audience. Rachel closed one laptop and opened another. Then we should begin. Daniel picked up his pen again. Ethan Walker looked at the photograph of Charles Whitmore on the screen one last time. Then he spoke the words that would quietly begin the fall of an empire. Start buying. Morning came slowly over Manhattan, a grey winter light filtering between the towers along Park Avenue. Inside the headquarters of Summit Ridge Capital, the city looked distant, almost unreal, as if the world below were part of a different story entirely. The conference room on the 52nd floor was quiet, except for the low hum of servers and the soft rhythm of keyboards. Rachel Morgan stood at the head of the long glass table, sleeves still rolled, eyes fixed on the massive screen covering the far wall. On it glowed a web of charts and transaction logs that stretched across London, Frankfurt, Zurich, and New York. Each blinking dot represented a small purchase of stock in Atlas Meridian Group, individually meaningless, together a slow tightening net. Daniel Brooks sat nearby with a legal file open, flipping pages methodically. His calm face betrayed nothing, but the pen in his hand moved faster than usual. Across the table, several financial analysts watched their screens with focused intensity, speaking only when necessary. The door opened. Ethan Walker entered without ceremony. Everyone in the room stood. He gave a small nod, nothing more, and took his seat at the center of the table. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations stopped. Screens refreshed. The quiet urgency of a mission moved through the room. Rachel began. We initiated purchases at market open in London, she said, tapping a control panel. The large screen shifted to a real-time chart of Atlas Meridian shares. 3 shell entities acquired initial positions within the first 15 minutes. How much? Ethan asked. 0.8% combined. Daniel looked up from his notes. Well within the safe zone. Rachel nodded. The remaining entities will rotate purchases throughout the week. No single structure will exceed the disclosure threshold. Ethan leaned back slightly. Good. On the screen, small blocks of stock were being quietly absorbed by the network Rachel had constructed overnight. The market interpreted them as routine activity, small hedge funds, institutional balancing. Nothing remarkable. Exactly as planned. One of the analysts spoke up. London analysts are attributing the volume spike to pension fund reallocations. Rachel allowed herself a faint smile. Let them. Daniel closed the legal file. As long as we stay under 5% ownership per entity, regulators won't require disclosure. And by the time they notice, Rachel added, it will already be too late. Ethan watched the numbers flow across the screen. To most people, they were meaningless columns of digits. But to him, they were pressure points, structural stress, the beginning of something inevitable. Has Whitmore reacted yet? He asked. Rachel shook her head. Not publicly. She pulled up another screen showing British financial news headlines. Atlas Meridian appeared in several articles, all routine coverage of quarterly reports and market forecasts. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Yet. Daniel folded his hands on the table. The pension fund exposure is still our biggest leverage point. Rachel nodded. I've had analysts combing through their internal reports. The accounting structure is worse than we thought. How much worse? Projected liabilities exceed their reserves by nearly £300 million. One of the younger analysts looked up from his laptop. If that information reaches the press, the stock will drop immediately. Daniel corrected him gently. Not immediately. First it creates doubt, then investors panic. Rachel glanced toward Ethan. Which is exactly when we buy the rest. Ethan said nothing. He was looking at something else on the screen. A photograph had appeared in the corner of the display. Charles Whitmore again. The British chairman smiling at a charity gala beside politicians and investors. A man comfortable with power. A man who believed his world was secure. Daniel noticed Ethan's gaze. He's speaking at an aviation conference in London next week. Rachel pulled up the schedule. Yes. Aurora Air is announcing a fleet modernization plan. Ethan finally spoke. Does he know about the pension exposure? Daniel shook his head. Hard to say. But if he does, he's hiding it well. Rachel added, from the outside, Atlas Meridian still looks stable. Ethan leaned forward slightly. That's the illusion we need. Another analyst raised a hand. Sir, if the press discovers the pension issue before we accumulate enough shares, they won't, Rachel said calmly. The analyst hesitated. How can we be certain? Rachel looked at Ethan. Ethan answered, because we'll decide when they discover it. Silence followed. The analysts exchanged brief glances. They had all heard stories about Ethan Walker's deals before joining Summit Ridge, but seeing it unfold from inside the room was something else entirely. Daniel broke the quiet. So the timeline? Rachel brought up a projection. Phase 1. Quiet accumulation. Estimated ownership target, 15%. Time frame, 3 months. Daniel nodded. That's enough to become the largest shareholder without attracting attention. Rachel switched slides. Phase 2. Strategic disclosure. The screen displayed a mock newspaper headline. Atlas Meridian Pension Crisis. Ethan's eyes remained on the screen. And Phase 3? He asked. Rachel smiled slightly. Control. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying the room. You realize this operation could shake the London financial establishment. Ethan didn't blink. That's their problem. Outside the windows, the city had brightened as morning traffic filled the streets below. Horns echoed faintly through the glass walls, but inside the conference room, the air remained cool and controlled. Rachel closed one laptop and opened another, containing transaction logs. "We've acquired another 0.4% since you walked in." Ethan nodded. "Good." Daniel tapped the table lightly. "There's something else you should consider." Ethan looked at him. "The airline incident," Daniel continued. "Eventually someone will connect the timing." Rachel answered before Ethan could. "Not unless Ethan makes the connection public." Daniel smiled. "And will he?" Ethan stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked to the window overlooking Manhattan, hands resting lightly behind his back. For a moment, he watched the city. Millions of people moving through their lives. Cars, offices, markets, every decision rippling outward into consequences most of them would never see. Then he spoke. "No." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "No." Ethan turned back toward the room. "This isn't revenge." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it?" Ethan's voice was calm but carried the weight of something larger than a simple corporate acquisition. "It's correction." The analysts watched him in silence. Rachel studied his expression carefully. She had seen that look before. During negotiations worth billions. During moments when entire companies changed ownership with a single signature. The look meant the outcome was already decided. Daniel closed his file. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose we should continue buying." Rachel turned back to the screens. Orders began moving again across European exchanges. Small purchases, invisible shifts. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Charles Whitmore was likely sipping tea in a London boardroom, completely unaware that the foundation beneath his empire had already begun to move. And all because a man in seat 2A had been told he did not belong. 6 months passed without a single public signal that anything had changed. London moved as it always did. Black cab rolled through rain-polished streets. Bankers in dark coats hurried between stone buildings older than the country that now quietly targeted them. In private clubs along Pall Mall, men with silver hair and careful voices discussed markets over glasses of scotch, as if the financial world were a stable machine that ran on tradition. Atlas Meridian Group appeared strong. Its stock traded steadily. Quarterly reports showed modest profit. Analysts described the company as conservative, resilient, perhaps even dull. Exactly the kind of stability Charles Whitmore valued. Inside the oak-paneled boardroom of Atlas Meridian's London headquarters, Whitmore sat at the head of the long table, reviewing a set of printed reports. He disliked reading financial documents on screens. Paper felt real, tangible, reliable. Shipping division exceeded projections this quarter, one executive was saying. Whitmore nodded absently. At 67, he carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone who had spent his entire life inside corridors of power. His family name opened doors across European finance. 3 generations of Whitmores had sat in this very building, directing fleets, rail networks, and corporations. To Whitmore, Atlas Meridian was not simply a company. It was inheritance. And inheritance, in his mind, did not collapse. "Any concerns?" he asked without looking up from the page. The room remained quiet. None of the directors present wished to be the one who introduced doubt into Whitmore's morning meeting. Finally, a younger board member cleared his throat. There has been slightly increased trading activity in our shares. Whitmore looked up. How slight? Nothing dramatic. Institutional investors adjusting positions. Whitmore waved a dismissive hand. Markets move. That is their purpose. The meeting continued. Charts were presented. Budgets discussed. Future hotel acquisitions debated. Not one person in the room realized that across dozens of anonymous investment accounts scattered through Luxembourg, Zurich, and the Cayman Islands, Summit Ridge Capital had just crossed a silent threshold. 15% ownership. The largest shareholder in Atlas Meridian Group. In Manhattan, the news arrived in a very different room. Deep beneath the Summit Ridge headquarters, in a secure operations floor, the staff informally called the Forge, dozens of screens glowed with real-time market data. Rachel Morgan stood at the center console, reviewing the latest numbers. "We've done it," she said. Daniel Brooks looked up from his laptop. "Confirmed?" Rachel nodded. 15.2% combined through 27 acquisition entities. Daniel leaned back slowly. That makes us the largest shareholder. Across the room, several analysts exchanged quiet looks of disbelief. Even after months of planning, the scale of the operation still felt surreal. Rachel glanced toward the entrance. "Where's Ethan?" "He's on his way down." As if summoned by the words, the elevator doors opened. Ethan Walker stepped into the room. He wore a dark blue suit, no tie, his expression calm as always. Yet the energy in the room shifted immediately as every analyst straightened slightly in their chairs. Rachel handed him a tablet. "Congratulations." Ethan scanned the numbers briefly. The total position glowed on the screen. 15.2%. He nodded once. "Good work." Daniel closed his laptop. Whitmore still doesn't know. Rachel smiled faintly. "He thinks the market fluctuations are normal institutional trading." Ethan placed the tablet on the table. "For now." Rachel turned to another screen, displaying a graph of Atlas Meridian's pension fund exposure. The next phase? Ethan studied the chart. 6 months earlier, the pension deficit had been little more than a hidden accounting weakness. Now it was a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. "Is the documentation ready?" he asked. Rachel nodded. Our analysts confirmed everything. Their pension fund is backed almost entirely by Atlas Meridian stock. If the market loses confidence, Daniel finished the sentence, the fund collapses. Ethan folded his arms. Then it's time the market asks questions. Rachel looked at him carefully. "You want the story leaked?" "Yes." Daniel frowned slightly. "To which outlet?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "The Financial Times." Rachel smiled. "That will hurt." Daniel adjusted his glasses. A detailed investigation from them would trigger immediate scrutiny. "Exactly." Rachel walked to another workstation and pulled up a contact file. "Michael Davis," she said. "Senior financial correspondent. Known for exposing corporate accounting scandals." Ethan nodded. "Arrange a meeting." "Directly?" "No." Rachel understood immediately. Anonymous source. Daniel chuckled softly. "Of course." Ethan turned back toward the large screen at the center of the room. On it, the Atlas Meridian share price moved slowly across the graph. Stable, quiet, unaware. "For 6 months," he said, "we've been building the foundation." Rachel watched him. "And now?" Ethan's voice remained calm. "Now we introduce gravity." Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his Manhattan apartment overlooking the Hudson River. The city outside shimmered with night traffic and reflections from the water. A glass of bourbon rested untouched beside his phone on the table. He dialed a number. Across the Atlantic, the line rang inside a quiet London office. Michael Davis answered. "Davis speaking." Ethan spoke slowly. "I understand you've been looking into pension fund irregularities." The journalist paused. "Who is this?" "Someone who believes Atlas Meridian's numbers deserve a closer look." Davis leaned forward slightly in his chair. "What kind of closer look?" Ethan stared out across the dark river. "The kind that might affect the retirement savings of thousands of employees." Silence. Davis's voice lowered. "You have documents, yes?" "Proof?" "Yes." Another pause. Finally, Davis spoke. "Send them." Ethan ended the call. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked out at the skyline where millions of windows burned with light. Somewhere across the ocean, Charles Whitmore would soon wake to a world that no longer obeyed the rules he believed protected him. And for the first time in the history of Atlas Meridian Group, the empire would begin to feel the first tremor beneath its throne. The article appeared on a cold London morning just before the markets opened. Financial Times, front page, Atlas Meridian Pension Fund exposed. Inside the London headquarters of Atlas Meridian Group, the newspaper landed on Charles Whitmore's desk with a sharp slap. Whitmore stared at the headline. For a moment, he did not move. Then his face turned red. "This is nonsense," he said. Across the boardroom table, several executives sat frozen, their eyes shifting between the article and the chairman. Whitmore flipped through the pages with growing agitation. The article was not vague speculation. It was detailed, brutally precise. It described the pension fund deficit, the internal accounting adjustments, the reliance on Atlas Meridian stock to secure retirement liabilities. Numbers, dates, internal memos. Whitmore slammed the paper down. "Who leaked this?" No one answered, because everyone in the room understood something the chairman refused to accept. The article was accurate. A younger board member spoke carefully. "Sir, the market will react." Whitmore shot him a glare. "Then we reassure the market." But even as he said the words, the first alerts began buzzing across the phones on the table. Share price, down 3%. Another alert, down 5%. Someone opened a laptop. The trading graph dropped sharply across the screen like a cliff. Whitmore's voice hardened. "This is market manipulation." But the phones kept vibrating. Across London, investors were already moving. Funds began dumping Atlas Meridian shares. Analysts flooded television networks. Financial commentators dissected the article sentence by sentence. The narrative spread fast. Pension fund instability, corporate mismanagement, hidden financial risk. Within hours, the stock had dropped 8%. In Manhattan, Rachel Morgan watched the same graph collapse across the massive screens inside the forge. The analysts around her spoke in quick bursts of technical updates. European markets reacting aggressively. Large institutional sell orders entering the exchange. Liquidity increasing. Rachel turned toward Ethan Walker. He stood near the back of the room with his hands resting behind his back, watching the screen with calm focus. The red line on the chart plunged further. Daniel Brooks leaned toward Rachel. "Time to begin phase 2. Rachel nodded. She turned to the analysts. "Prepare the acquisition channels." One of them hesitated. "Now?" Rachel's voice was firm. "Now?" Across dozens of trading platforms hidden behind shell corporations, Summit Ridge Capital began buying. Small blocks of shares at first, then larger ones. Each purchase absorbed the panic flooding the market. Investors were selling in fear. Ethan was buying in silence. Within minutes, the ownership percentage on Rachel's private dashboard began climbing. 15.2, 16.1, 17.5. Daniel watched the numbers carefully. If the market drops another 5%, we could reach 20% by tomorrow. Rachel glanced at Ethan. He said nothing. He simply kept watching the graph. The phone on the table rang. Rachel answered. "Rachel Morgan." The voice on the other end spoke quickly. "London markets just halted Atlas Meridian trading for volatility." Rachel muted the call and looked toward Ethan. "Trading suspension." Ethan nodded slightly. That was faster than expected. Daniel smiled faintly. Fear travels faster than logic. Rachel returned to the call. "How long is the halt?" 30 minutes. Rachel hung up. The analysts in the room shifted restlessly. 30 minutes in global finance was both an eternity and nothing at all. Daniel spoke quietly. "When trading resumes, the market will panic again." Rachel nodded. "And we'll be ready." Across the Atlantic, chaos filled the Atlas Meridian boardroom. Whitmore paced near the windows while executives spoke over each other. "This article has triggered regulatory inquiries. We're receiving calls from pension trustees. The media wants a statement." Whitmore stopped. "Then give them one." "What should we say?" Whitmore's voice carried the tone of command he had used for decades. "We say, Atlas Meridian remains financially sound. We say the article exaggerates routine pension adjustments." A communications director spoke cautiously. "Sir, if the numbers are verified," Whitmore cut him off. "They won't be." But his voice lacked its usual certainty. Outside the building, television crews had already begun assembling. Inside the trading floor, financial analysts watched Atlas Meridian's stock chart with growing alarm. The halt ended. Trading resumed. Within seconds, the market erupted again. Sell orders flooded the exchange. The price dropped another 4%. Back in Manhattan, Rachel's dashboard refreshed. Ownership climbed again. 19%. 20.3. Daniel exhaled slowly. "We're approaching controlling influence." Rachel's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard. "Continue purchasing." One analyst looked up nervously. "Won't regulators notice this level of accumulation?" Daniel answered calmly. "Each purchase still comes from separate entities." Rachel added, On paper, these investors have nothing in common. Ethan finally spoke. Keep buying. The analysts obeyed. Shares continued to flow through the network of shell corporations like water filling hidden reservoirs. By late afternoon London time, the number appeared on Rachel's screen. 24%. She turned toward Ethan. We're almost there. Ethan nodded. Good. Rachel hesitated. When do we reveal ourselves? Ethan walked closer to the main display. On it, the Atlas Meridian stock chart flickered between red and green as investors fought to understand what was happening. When we reach 28%, Daniel raised an eyebrow. Why 28? Ethan answered without hesitation. At that point, the board can't stop us. Rachel understood. With 28% ownership, you become the dominant shareholder. Daniel smiled slightly. And Whitmore becomes a man defending a throne that no longer belongs to him. Ethan watched the numbers one more time. Across the Atlantic, Charles Whitmore was giving interviews, denying the crisis, promising stability. But the foundation beneath him had already shifted. Rachel refreshed the dashboard. 26%. Then 27%. She looked at Ethan. One more wave of purchases. The room held its breath. A final set of orders executed across the European exchanges. The number changed. 28%. Rachel leaned back slowly. Done. Daniel closed his laptop. Atlas Meridian has a new master. Ethan Walker stood silently in the glow of the screens. Across an ocean, an empire had just changed hands, and Charles Whitmore still had no idea who had taken it. The headline hit London before sunrise. Ornexi Capital acquires 28% of Atlas Meridian Group. Every major financial terminal in the city lit up with the same alert within minutes. Bloomberg, Reuters, Financial Times, Sky Business. Across Canary Wharf, analysts froze in front of their screens as the name Ethan Walker began circulating through trading floors like an electric current. Inside Atlas Meridian headquarters, Charles Whitmore read the news standing in the marble lobby. His driver had just handed him the morning edition of the Financial Times. For several seconds, Whitmore simply stared at the page. Then he read the headline again. 28%, he murmured. Around him, the lobby had gone strangely quiet. Assistants, reception staff, junior executives passing through the building had all seen the same headline. Some tried to avoid looking at him. Others watched openly. Whitmore's hand trembled slightly as he folded the newspaper. Who, he said slowly, is Ethan Walker? No one answered. Because until that moment, almost none of them knew either. Upstairs, the emergency board meeting was already being assembled. Phones rang. Secretaries rushed between offices. The boardroom doors closed with a heavy thud. Whitmore entered last. He walked to the head of the long table, placed the newspaper down in front of him, and sat. Explain this, he said. One of the finance directors opened a laptop. Over the past 6 months, multiple institutional investors acquired shares through intermediary holdings. Cayman structures, Luxembourg vehicles. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. And none of you noticed? The room remained silent. Another director spoke cautiously. The purchases remained below disclosure thresholds. Whitmore leaned forward. Until now. Yes. The director turned the screen toward him. A filing document glowed on the display. Onexi Capital. 28% ownership. Whitmore read the name again. Onexi. He looked up. Who are they? No one answered immediately. Finally, the youngest board member cleared his throat. American private equity firm, founded by Ethan Walker. Whitmore frowned. Walker. He said the name like it tasted unfamiliar. What does he want? Across the Atlantic, Ethan Walker sat at the center of the Summit Ridge boardroom, watching the same news coverage. Rachel Morgan stood beside him. Daniel Brooks leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed. On the large screen in front of them, financial networks were already discussing the story, markets stunned by surprise acquisition. Unknown American investor seizes major stake in British conglomerate. Who is Ethan Walker? Rachel smiled faintly. They're asking the right question. Daniel glanced toward Ethan. Have you decided when to answer it? Ethan's eyes remained on the screen. Soon. Rachel opened another file. Atlas Meridian stock surged after the announcement. Investors are betting on leadership change. Daniel chuckled softly. The market loves a coup. Rachel scrolled further. Several institutional shareholders have already signaled support for restructuring. Ethan nodded. They were waiting for someone to challenge Whitmore. Daniel looked thoughtful. Old aristocratic leadership works until the numbers start collapsing. Rachel added quietly, and until someone younger, smarter, and far more dangerous walks in. Across the ocean, Whitmore's boardroom was unraveling. A communications director spoke urgently. The media wants a statement. Whitmore waved a hand. We will release one. What should it say? Whitmore stared down the table. Atlas Meridian remains stable. We welcome constructive investors, but reject hostile interference. Another board member hesitated. Sir, with 28% ownership, Walker can call a shareholder vote. Whitmore's jaw tightened. He will not control this company. The director spoke carefully. Legally, he may already. Whitmore stood abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. This company was built by my family over 3 generations. No one spoke, because history, for the first time in that room, no longer seemed like protection. Back in Manhattan, Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Interesting. What? Daniel asked. Rachel smiled. Charles Whitmore just agreed to appear on BBC this afternoon. Daniel laughed quietly. Perfect. Ethan turned toward her. Put it on. Rachel tapped the remote. The screen shifted to a live broadcast from London. Whitmore sat in a television studio beside a BBC interviewer. The lighting was bright. The background displayed the Atlas Meridian logo. The interviewer spoke first. Sir Charles, the markets are reacting dramatically to the news that Onexi Capital now controls 28% of your company. What is your response? Whitmore leaned slightly forward. This development is unfortunate, but not unprecedented. Financial markets attract opportunists. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Opportunists, Whitmore continued. Mr. Walker represents a certain type of investor focused solely on short-term gains. Atlas Meridian represents something much larger. The interviewer nodded. You mean tradition? Yes, Whitmore said firmly. Tradition. Responsibility. Standards. Daniel murmured softly. Here it comes. The interviewer asked the next question. Many investors argue that Atlas Meridian has stagnated in recent years. They believe new leadership might be necessary. Whitmore's expression hardened. Those investors misunderstand the nature of this company. And Mr. Walker? Whitmore's lip curled slightly. Mr. Walker comes from a very different world than ours. Rachel's smile widened. The interviewer leaned closer. What do you mean by that? Whitmore hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he said it. A world where money is the only measure of value. A world where people like him believe they can buy respect. The studio fell quiet. Rachel looked at Ethan. That line will age badly. Daniel shook his head slowly. He just turned this into something personal. Ethan watched the screen without blinking. Whitmore continued speaking, unaware of what he had just done. Atlas Meridian is not for sale, and certainly not to someone who does not understand who we are. The interview ended moments later. Rachel muted the television. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Daniel exhaled. Well? Rachel looked at Ethan. He just made himself the villain. Ethan stood. His expression remained calm, but something deeper had settled behind his eyes. Good. Rachel tilted her head. You were hoping for that? Yes. Daniel frowned. Why? Ethan walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Because now, he said quietly, this isn't just about a company anymore. Rachel waited. Ethan looked back at the screen where Whitmore's interview replayed silently. It's about the future replacing the past. And somewhere in London, Charles Whitmore still believed the battle had only begun. He had no idea it was already over. Morning in London arrived with a thin mist hanging over the Thames and a line of black cars stretching along the curb outside the Savoy Hotel. Reporters crowded the entrance, microphones raised, camera flashes cutting through the grey air like lightning. A brass plaque near the doorway read Special Shareholders Meeting, Atlas Meridian Group. Inside, the grand ballroom had been transformed into a conference hall. Chandeliers glowed over rows of investors, lawyers, analysts and journalists, waiting to witness the vote that could change the future of one of Britain's oldest financial empires. Charles Whitmore sat at the front table, shoulders straight, chin lifted with the practiced dignity of a man who had spent his entire life believing the world belonged to people like him. Yet his hands, resting on the polished walnut surface, trembled almost imperceptibly. The room murmured with quiet tension. Everyone knew the numbers. 28% ownership held by a man most of them had never heard of 6 months earlier. Institutional investors shifting their loyalties. Pension funds demanding reform. The balance of power had already tilted, but tradition dies slowly, and Whitmore still believed he could hold the line. Across the hall, the doors opened again. Ethan Walker entered. He walked beside Rachel Morgan, Daniel Brooks, and 2 advisors from Summit Ridge. No security escort. No dramatic entrance. Just a steady stride across the carpeted floor as the whispers in the room rose like a wave. Cameras turned, heads pivoted. Investors leaned forward in their chairs. That's him, the American, the man who bought the company. Ethan said nothing. His expression remained calm, unreadable. He took his seat at the opposite side of the table and folded his hands in front of him. The moderator struck the gavel. This extraordinary meeting of Atlas Meridian shareholders will now begin. The room fell silent. Whitmore stood first. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the table as he faced the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep and carefully controlled, "Atlas Meridian has served this nation for more than 3 generations. My father and grandfather built this institution on principles of stability, responsibility, and tradition. Today we face an aggressive attempt to dismantle that legacy." A few loyal shareholders applauded politely. Whitmore continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Mr. Walker represents a new breed of investor, one that believes companies are nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Atlas Meridian is not a spreadsheet. It is a pillar of British enterprise." He paused, scanning the room. "I ask you to consider carefully before surrendering control of this institution to someone who has never walked our halls, never carried our responsibility, and never understood what it means to protect a legacy." His final words hung in the air. For a moment, there was silence, then scattered applause from the older members seated near the front. Whitmore sat down slowly, his jaw set tight. The moderator turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, you may address the shareholders." Ethan stood. No papers, no notes, just a quiet step forward to the podium. The room stilled again. Even the journalists stopped typing. "Good morning," Ethan said. His voice carried easily through the hall, calm and steady, with the faint trace of American cadence. "Sir Charles spoke about history. I would like to speak about the future." A few investors leaned forward. Ethan's gaze moved slowly across the audience. For the past decade, Atlas Meridian has been drifting, profits declining, innovation stalled, debt increasing. Meanwhile, the leadership has insisted that tradition alone will protect the company from change. He paused. But tradition does not balance a balance sheet. Several heads nodded. Ethan continued. "I did not invest in Atlas Meridian to destroy it. I invested because I believe it can become something stronger than it has ever been." Whitmore shifted in his chair but said nothing. Ethan's voice grew firmer. "We will restructure inefficient divisions. We will repair the pension fund that has been quietly deteriorating for years. We will modernize operations across every subsidiary, including Aurora Air." A murmur moved through the audience. Ethan took a breath. "But more importantly, we will build a company that measures success not by heritage, but by performance." He looked directly toward Whitmore. "Legacy deserves respect, but legacy alone does not earn the future." Silence. Then Ethan delivered the final line. "A company survives only when it treats every person within it with fairness and accountability." For a moment, no one moved. Then a single clap echoed from somewhere in the middle rows. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. The sound rolled upward toward the chandeliers like thunder. Whitmore sat motionless. He understood. The room had already chosen. Minutes later, the voting results appeared on the large screen behind the podium. 82% in favor of removing Charles Whitmore as chairman of Atlas Meridian Group. The moderator cleared his throat. By the authority of the shareholders, Mr. Ethan Walker is hereby elected chairman of Atlas Meridian Group. The room erupted again. Reporters surged forward. Camera flashes exploded across the hall. Investors stood to shake hands with Rachel and Daniel. But Ethan remained still. He walked slowly toward Whitmore. The former chairman sat in his chair, staring at the table as if the wood grain might somehow rearrange the outcome. Ethan stopped beside him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan leaned slightly closer. "When you sit at the top," he said quietly, "you should learn to respect the people beneath you." Whitmore looked up. His voice sounded smaller now. "Who are you?" Ethan held his gaze. "Just a passenger," he said. "The one your airline once told didn't belong in first class." Whitmore blinked. The meaning settled slowly across his face. Ethan straightened and walked away toward the doors where the reporters waited. Outside the Savoy Hotel, the cameras exploded in a storm of flashes as he stepped into the daylight. One journalist shouted over the noise, "Mr. Walker, was this revenge?" Ethan paused. For a moment the crowd went silent. Then he answered calmly, "No." He looked across the street where the grey clouds over London had begun to break. It was correction. The next morning, the Financial Times carried a headline that stretched across the entire front page. From seat 2A to the chairman's seat. The article spread across the financial world before most people had finished their morning coffee. Television networks replayed the footage from the Savoy meeting. Analysts debated the takeover. Investors discussed what it meant for the future of Atlas Meridian. But inside the former office of Charles Whitmore, the room was quiet. The heavy oak desk remained exactly where it had always stood. The leather chair behind it was the same chair Whitmore's father had once used, and his grandfather before that. Yet the man sitting there now looked entirely different. Ethan Walker studied the skyline of London through the tall window behind the desk. The Thames curved below like a grey ribbon through the city. Parliament stood in the distance, ancient and unmoving, a reminder that institutions always believed they were permanent, until they weren't. Rachel Morgan entered the office carrying a tablet. "The board has approved the first phase of restructuring," she said. Ethan turned from the window. "Good." Rachel placed the tablet on the desk and began reviewing the changes. "Leadership transition begins immediately. Natalie Pierce will take over as Chief Executive Officer." Ethan nodded once. Natalie Pierce had been the only independent voice on the Atlas Meridian board months earlier. The only one willing to admit the company had been drifting toward collapse. Rachel continued, 3 non-performing divisions will be dissolved. Debt restructuring begins next quarter, and Aurora Air will undergo a full operational overhaul. Daniel Brooks stepped into the office behind her. "And the pension fund crisis is already stabilizing," he added. Markets reacted positively to the leadership change. Ethan walked back toward the desk and glanced at the tablet. Numbers moved across the screen. Share value rising. Investor confidence returning. The company that had been sliding toward decline only weeks earlier now looked stronger than it had in years. Rachel folded her arms. "You know what the press is calling this?" Ethan looked up. "The Meridian Reset," Daniel chuckled softly. "Journalists love dramatic names." Rachel smiled faintly. "They're not wrong." Later that afternoon, Ethan stood in the boardroom, addressing the newly restructured leadership team. The large screen behind him displayed a plan titled Meridian Forward Initiative. Executives listened carefully as he spoke. "We are not rebuilding this company to preserve its past," Ethan said calmly. "We are rebuilding it to earn its future." Charts appeared behind him, showing the transformation strategy. Modernization of Aurora Air, investment in renewable logistics, expansion of global hospitality partnerships. But one slide drew the most attention. Cross Horizons Scholarship Program. Rachel watched the room as Ethan explained. This fund will support students from underserved communities pursuing careers in aviation, engineering, and technology. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. Ethan continued, "Talent should never be limited by opportunity." The room responded with quiet approval. For the first time in years, Atlas Meridian's leadership team felt something unfamiliar. Hope. 3 months later, the transformation was already visible. Aurora Air began unveiling redesigned aircraft interiors. Customer satisfaction scores rose sharply. The airline's training program introduced a new philosophy built around respect and professionalism. The slogan appeared across internal communications: "Respect above altitude." Across the Atlantic, the story that had started everything resurfaced unexpectedly. The video recorded by a passenger on that original flight finally appeared online. Millions watched the footage. The chief flight attendant standing in the aisle, her suspicious tone. The moment Ethan Walker was asked to leave his seat. The internet reacted instantly. News channels replayed the clip beside footage of Ethan now standing at the helm of a multinational corporation. Within days, the flight attendant was dismissed from her position. But Ethan never mentioned her name publicly. During a leadership conference months later, someone in the audience asked about the incident. Ethan paused before answering. "Power isn't about removing someone from a seat," he said calmly. "It's about building a world where no one feels the need to." The audience fell silent, because they understood the weight of the words. 1 year later, a newly redesigned Aurora Air aircraft cruised high above the Atlantic, 35,000 feet. Inside the first-class cabin, the lighting was warm and quiet. A young flight attendant approached a familiar seat. "Seat 2A. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Walker," she said with a warm smile. Ethan looked up from the window. "Thank you. Would you like champagne?" He shook his head gently. "Water is fine." She nodded and walked away. Ethan leaned back in the seat. Outside the window, the clouds stretched across the sky like endless white silk. The engines hummed with steady power as the aircraft moved quietly through the air. A year earlier, he had been asked to leave this very seat. Now the airline itself belonged to the company he led. Yet there was no triumph in his expression, only quiet reflection. Below the clouds, the world continued turning. Prejudice had not disappeared. Injustice had not vanished. But something had shifted. Just enough. A small correction in the balance. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. They had thrown him out of seat 2A. And because of that moment, he had learned how to fly higher than anyone expected. Later that evening, a news broadcast summarized the story in a single sentence. The man who was once removed from a plane now owns the sky. But the real victory had never been about money or power. It was about proving that dignity cannot be taken away by someone else's judgment. It can only be revealed by how far a person rises after being underestimated. And somewhere above the Atlantic, seat 2A remained occupied by a quiet passenger looking out the window, knowing that justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with patience. Sometimes it arrives with vision. And sometimes it arrives with the courage to turn a moment of humiliation into a future no one else believed possible. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to support the message it carries. Like the video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey, and share 3 simple words in the comments. Justice takes flight.